Is old school RuneScape's Project Rebalance a well-needed adjustment or another evolution of combat? Let's dive into these changes and see where we're headed. Quick aside, the blog, video, and QA released by the dev team will go into more detail, and I recommend you check those out for yourself. To summarize their main objective, it is to better utilize existing content, and they've set the stage with 3 sub-goals. First, more levers to pull for balancing and rewards in the future. 2, more specialized weapons for different places. And 3, bring the elemental spellbook up to par with the other spellbooks for combat. Let's talk about goal number 1, future balancing with more levers. First things first, why? To me, it means they want to add additional ways to adjust the DPS of specific weapons against specific mobs. For instance, if you want to nerf the blowpipe at Zulrah today, you have 2 options. Nerf the attack stats of the blowpipe, or raise the range defense of Zulrah. The problem with this is you've now either made the blowpipe worse everywhere, or you've made Zulrah slower and harder with every range weapon. So I get the idea here. More control over exactly how weapons perform in content. In general, it's probably for the best, but does open the door for over-tuning and turning OSRS into a pure DPS calculator. But we'll talk about that more going through the styles. Additionally, they reference they want to have more space for future rewards, so new raids and bosses have space. At the surface, this sounds great, but I think they're overemphasizing the impact of defensive stats for meaningful rewards. As a counterpoint, and to the devs' credit, look at all the interesting and unique gear they've already been able to produce just this year. Goal number 2, specialized weapons. Why? The devs want to reward us for getting a wider range of gear, rather than achieving a single upgrade that is the only item you'll use for a long time. The example they love here is the gargoyles. These days, once you've got a whip, you just use it everywhere. But gargoyles are supposed to be weak to crush, and you should be rewarded for optimizing your gear a bit more. This should encourage players to explore more content and get more gear to better suit each job. In general, I think this is good. It gives players a reason to go out and seek weapons of similar power for different styles, and will encourage engaging with more content and smooths out that progression from the giant jumps that exist today. It does, however, run the risk of making once distinct and special items feel like they're just reskins without anything special between them. For example, would the D-Skim feel as iconic and unlock if it's really only your best level 60 attack weapon at 1/3 of the mobs, contending with the sword and the mace? What's also curious is they didn't mention continuing going down the path of the Dragon Hunter Lance or the Dragon Hunter Crossbow for other specific bosses or creature types. This does offer that bespoke upgrade without having to adjust anything, but I imagine their thought process is adding one of these for every type of monster would just become tedious to keep track of. Goal number 3, elemental spellbook damage increase. Why? Because the standard spellbook feels weak, and that makes a good portion of magic feel underutilized and potentially useless. Magic combat is currently the powered staff plus some other book meta. I've got a lot to say about this one, but it's isolated to magic and we're going to go through style by style, so I'll cover it there. But one thing I want to cover before we do that is talk about balance in general. What is balance? It's recently become equated exclusively with DPS, and I think that's a bit of a miss. There are other ways to balance things. Difficulty in obtaining the item can lead to prohibitive costs, degradability may lead to a high cost of upkeep, risking low HP with Darox leaves you exposed but also with the potential for huge hits. Healing, prayer drain, special attack regen are all mechanics that have made space for new items that people actually prefer over raw DPS upgrades in many scenarios. Generally, I hope the team focuses on bringing additional balance by bringing utility to more items and spellbooks, instead of just exclusively crunching damage numbers for balancing. Of course, DPS is a component of balance, but it's just not the only lever. We can also balance between the 3 styles. Currently, it feels like in a lot of places, range is just the meta. My take here is actually magic should be the least powerful DPS-wise, followed by range, and then melee. Magic can bring so many things to the fight. Range and melee can't teleblock, bind, or heal except for some special attacks, and then range should be weaker than melee because you can just position yourself safely, safe spot, keep distance, etc. Melee should be the strongest by default, as it's just the most risky to pull off and in many scenarios requires close quarters. It's just a thought on how things have developed and the strength of items not just within the styles but between them as well. Now with that out of the way, let's dive into each individual style. Melee. The changes to melee are pretty straightforward. Widen the gap between styles so that crush weapons clearly perform better at monsters weak to crush than slash or stab do, and similarly for the other styles. Generally, I think this is great and it achieves both goal 1 and goal 2, which I agree with. However, there is something that Jagex said that I think is a bit misguided and may highlight some of the problems beneath the surface of the design for other styles. They said melee is so diverse because of the different styles within it, crush, slash, and stab. I kind of disagree with this. Looking at the chart they show, most of these weapons are just special attack weapons, or weapons with very unique effects. The Fang and Dragon Hunter Lance aren't strong or unique because they're stab, but because they have unique effects that make them dominate dragons and high defense monsters. The Scythe isn't strong because it has an absurd slash attack, It's because it does more damage to bigger mobs. In fact, I think Melee still has plenty of room to have faster and weaker weapons or slower and stronger weapons. Pretty much anything outside of the special attack weapons, which you use once every couple minutes, is a 4 or 5 tick weapon, and everything is 1 tile attack distance. Maybe halberds could finally have a place, or a melee style blowpipe. I do like the idea of rewarding having different weapons and gear at mobs weak to that style. However, it does run the risk of making some of those iconic upgrades and items lose their weight. In the same way, it could feel good to get all 3 styles of dragon weapons, so now you can optimize your damage at different slayer tasks. It also means unlocking that dragon scimitar is a little less meaningful, as it will only be that best upgrade for 1/3 of the time. There's no right or wrong answer here, it's really just how individuals feel about spreading out the reward space. But executed properly, I think in general this will be a positive change, and it'll be meaningful to fill out that arsenal and feel like each reward has some space to shine. The final caveat here is just that if you take the tuning too far and it doesn't feel like a choice but a requirement to have the right style all the time, it's possible you drive people to misery getting every item to be efficient. You don't have to be optimal, but people love to optimize the fun out of games. So it's important to consider how adding more requirements for meta progression will affect players. Range. Essentially the plan here is to copy Melee, and they've suggested a similar 3-style system: light, standard, and heavy. But 2 things immediately jump out to me here. A hot take. If you disregard the special attacks from Melee, range already feels more distinct. If you think about Melee, you have the Skim, Whip, Fang, Scythe, Soul Reaper. That's kind of the only items you use. They are all 4-tick and 5-tick weapons with 1 tile attack range. And again, what makes it special is not that it's slash, it's that it has this really cool effect. You could do the same thing on a stab or crush weapon. I don't really think that would make the Soul Reaper different. For range, using the blowpipe, knives, bofa, T-bow, crossbows, ballista feel very different. They have different ranges and attack speeds, all the way from 2 ticks to 6 ticks. To me, what separates Melee is a wide variety of special attacks that range just doesn't have. Second, the system just isn't the same as crush, stab, and slash. In Melee, those styles don't really tell you anything about a weapon, except its general shape. A curved sword probably does slash, a blunt weapon probably does crush, but you could have a fast crush weapon like a nunchuck, or a slow one like the Elder Maul. You could have a little karambit knife for slash, or the big 2-handed scythe. But heavy range weapons feel like they need to be slow and accurate. It's in the name. They are heavy. Similarly, light ammo weapons are going to be high attack speed and low damage, low accuracy, and low range. Perhaps I'm just caught up in the names, but in a way that's already what the range defense system does. If you crank up range defense today, you disproportionately hurt the blowpipe while making bofa and T-bow more viable. My point is, these ammo styles already imply so much about the weapon, it doesn't allow for much variety within each style. As an example, could we really ever see a 3-tick heavy ammo weapon? Or a very slow light weapon would just seem odd. To actually match Melee, it feels like it should be more like piercing ammo, flesh ammo, and some middle ground, so that different weapon styles can exist. Otherwise, all the light weapons are going to feel the same, all the heavy weapons are going to feel the same. One last point is that something weak to light ammo today would have low range defense. For example, the blowpipe is good at the fight games, but not so good against the wardens at TOA. So in the new system, we would expect things weak to light to also have generally low range defense, with even lower in light. Like, wouldn't it be weird if something had low light defense, but really high standard and heavy? Because if light ammo could pierce it, why would standard and heavy not? You can see this in the changes. The only thing they've proposed to reduce is heavy defense, meaning those heavy weapons become more accurate. But why not just buff heavy weapons range bonus today if they don't cut it? They won't outperform light weaponry anyways in a low defense scenario, since their attack speed is too slow. I don't know, I feel like they're onto something with range here, and being able to move towards the Melee type of progression they've shown where different weapons excel at different places sounds good. But the execution they've laid out here doesn't actually seem very different from today at all. I think a little more time in the oven of how to split range weapons to make it feel different in each style, like Melee has much more potential to be better. In any case, this will give them more control of exactly how strong certain weapons are at certain bosses without having to adjust the overall speed of the boss for other substyles, or that weapon across the game. So it's possible that they tune this and make it feel like there's diversity in what you're doing for the bosses and encourage you to bring different weapons, which is the whole point. I'm not trying to say these changes aren't good and they can't get the job done, but more that the suggested ammo types are very tightly aligned with kind of the existing spectrum of defense bonuses, and there may be a bigger opportunity if these types could transcend weapon style, speed, range, etc. Magic. This is the big one. They want to buff the elemental spellbook to do more damage in more locations. I think the changes proposed here are fine at a micro level, but they send a more macro message that I'm not a fan of. In short, the first change is just to change all of the spells of the same tier, so all the strike spells with the different water, air, fire, and earth, to have the same max hit once you unlock the next spell. This doesn't really change anything today by itself. This would just mean Earth Strike could also hit 8s when you have Fire Strike. It's just a color change. What it does do is set up the elemental weakness changes that they want to make. The idea here is that certain monsters will have a debuff for a certain magic style, for example water, and you will have whatever the percentage of their weakness is as an increase to max hit and accuracy. I've got to say, this is a little underwhelming to me. Changing from Fire Surge to Earth Surge on my auto-cast staff is just not very interesting. I don't really see how this is any more engaging than using a powered staff, to be honest, or just continuing to use a fire spell. I mean, realistically, the bringing different gear and stuff like that in this case is going to be swapping your fire runes for earth runes. I think the implication here is that we're going to see more gear that will buff up certain spells or certain elements to provide progression in these cases. But at the moment without that, it doesn't really seem to add up to much, and we haven't heard anything concrete about adding such things. At the surface, I think bringing up the standard spellbook damage is fine, but to take the words from the devs themselves, magic has always been unique.
Magic is unique is a good thing, and leaning into the spellbooks helps with that.
I don't like reducing the spellbooks just into a DPS calculator. The standard spellbook has enchants, teleblocks, bones to beaches. Multiple spellbooks have things like binds, prayer draining effects. I think that's what makes RuneScape different from other MMOs in the first place. The spellbook is actually more than just a reskinned magic arrow in a lot of ways. While these spellbook changes do bring up the standard spellbook effectively, my fear is that the game is leaning away from the unique parts of old school, and is overly worried about ensuring perfectly balanced DPS. In my opinion, powered staves are always a step in the wrong direction. It takes away from magic, and it just turns magic into magic arrows. And the devs agree. It's the freezing, healing, TBing that make magic cool, and while it does add some diversity to what you bring, to me, bringing Surge is not really any different than a powered stave. I also think it's fine that the standard spellbook isn't the preeminent damage dealer. It's the starting spellbook, it offers a ton of utility, you can enchant things, do superheat and alchemy. The ancient spellbook, on the other hand, was created as an unlock and its focus is exclusively combat. I think it's fine that it's better at that role. Lunar's only real combat contribution is Vengeance, another unique way to bring damage and introduce mechanics without just firing more magic blasts. Lunar's also thrives with utility like the standard spellbook. You can do plank make, tan leather, and again, that's what makes magic magic. The real problem here is that the powered staves exist, and they can be used with any spellbook, so magic damage has been distilled down to only these weapons. I get the idea of diversifying that weapon slot by encouraging casting an offensive spell that isn't just from the staff, but I think they've already committed to having them. I think literally the best in slot weapon in the entire game right now is the Shadow. You'd think they lean into taking the standard spellbook with the powered staves, or maybe even requiring it. They could even prevent you from using any spellbook at all. Okay, wrapping up. I feel like most of these changes are generally good, but come with a couple risks that have to be executed properly. Widening the distance between items at certain mobs gives players a reasons to hunt for upgrades and gear that now rewards them more than just sticking to the same weapon everywhere. At the same time, having all these items feel bespoke to specific mobs, but overall very similar, can make once special upgrades feel like a checklist. The larger concerning trend is that discussions are heavily centered around DPS rather than exploring the tools that have always made the game distinct from other MMOs. The special attacks, weapon speeds, attack ranges, unique attacks, and more are being forgotten for the raw numbers of weapon styles. I think the new armors and weapons from Varlamore highlight the opportunity for new weapons, armors, and effects like what has made Darox and Varrox iconic for almost 20 years. I feel like there is still so much room with effects, changes in range, changes in attack speed for melee weapons. Let's make halberds good. Having more range special attacks, having new spells. Focusing only on DPS is missing some of what makes RuneScape. I hope the range styles don't pigeonhole us into the same weapons, since defense is now very similar to weapon feel instead of just an attribute like it is with melee. All in all, these changes should be positive for the game if executed properly, and we can only hope the developers tune things in a way where items and styles still feel distinct and meaningful, and every encounter is not just a reskinned DPS stick. Thanks for watching the video. It's something new I wanted to try out on the channel. Would love to hear what people think down in the comments below, and see you next time.